for my cheat sheets. Okay, so we're here today for Dan's capstone in ancient Greek history. And I would like to say first that I have thoroughly enjoyed working with Dan all semester. It's been my pleasure. Dan's project is on a battle in the Persian Wars, the Battle of Salamis, and he's going to look specifically at the leadership in that battle actually. And we started at the beginning of the semester by reading a classic Greek history by a British classicist. And then Dan continued, like all good historians, to read more and more and more. But what was really impressive about what he read was that he was committed to reading the translated primary sources on both sides of this battle. So that was really impressive. Actually, he read Herodotus' histories, he read the Persian Wars by Aeschylus, he read Thucydides, and then Plutarch, of course. But he followed all that up with secondary sources and the like, but ultimately he read a ton. And this project is really good, and I'm really proud of you. You did a really good job. And with no more of my mush, we will let Dan present his capstone, Themistocles and Xerxes at Salamis.
Thank you so much for all being here today. And a big thank you to Dr. Bingle. She's been working with me for the entire semester somehow, and it's been a pleasure to research this with you. So thank you. So I've loved Greece ever since I was a kid. I got really into it when I read like Percy Jackson and stuff like that, and ever since then I've really loved just the Greek story. And so that's kind of why we got here today. And we'll be looking at these two guys right here. You got Themistocles here on the left, you got Xerxes on the right. Now, if you're not a history major or history professor, you're probably thinking, who the heck are these guys? You're probably thinking, looks kind of more like that to you in the actual Greek and the actual cuneiform Persian. And you're probably thinking, like the famous Shakespeare said, it's Greek to me. So, one of my first goals here is just, and this was a learning goal for me to explain to you, but also that I took into learning about it myself, was just to get basic info on the entire Persian Wars, just to understand what actually happened this 2,500-ish years ago. And the main goal I want to be explaining has to do with contrasting Themistocles himself, the Greek naval leader of the Greeks, and Xerxes, the Persian leader, the king of the Persians, and their leadership styles, particularly in the Battle of Salamis. And finally, I want to do what Dr. Bingle, if you've taken any of her classes, will always say at the end of her class: why do we care? Why does this matter? Why does a battle that happened thousands of years ago matter to us today? And I think it does matter, and I think history in general matters. And I hope to convey that to you today. So we'll start in Greece, right here. So as you can tell, that's a pretty big orange spot. But the thing about Greece in about the 500s is about when we're going to start, is that it's a very, very diverse and unique and has a lot of different parts of it. And particularly in different types of Greek peoples. So if you have over here, you have like Ionians over here, you have Dorians over here, you have lots of different types of Greeks, and then also each of these cities would be their own kind of city-state, is what they call it, or a polis, and they would kind of be doing their own thing. So if you were a Corinthian, you wouldn't really like anybody that was an Athenian, even though you're both technically Greek. And so the Greek identity, while it did connect them linguistically and culturally to some degree, it was a very divided group, and it was a very, had a lot of different ideas. And one of the main reasons for that was they had a lot of different types of governments. Some of them were tyrannies, which has a bad connotation today, but at the time it wasn't really that same way. It just meant that there was one guy that was in charge of the entire city-state. And so there were good tyrants, and there were some bad tyrants. So some of the cities had tyrannies, but then some of them also had what they call oligarchies, where you have the leadership of either an elders type of group or more rich people. And then we also had things like Athens in about 507 BC became a democracy. And so then some of them were democracies. And so there was lots of different ideas about how to govern, which city was best. So there was a lot of different places there. And one thing you'll notice is that most of this is basically where Greece is, modern day Greece today. But these guys over here are on what would be in modern day Turkey or on Asia Minor. And that is right next to Persian Empire, which we will be going to right now. So while the Greeks were around for about it started in about the 8th century BC, and were there for about 300, 400 years by the years of 500 where we're going to be starting. The Persians came out of nowhere basically. Right around here is where Persepolis would be the capital, and they conquered incredibly quickly, mostly under Cyrus II, or Cyrus the Great. And he was able to do this mostly because there was a lot of big empires that he conquered. The first one being the Median Empire, which is like most of this here, and then he defeated the Babylonians. If you know your biblical history, you'll know that the Babylonians were kind of taken over here. That's when Israel falls the first time, and then when, well, the northern field, and then they eventually were taken over by the Persians. So even just by Cyrus, by 530, they are a massive empire, and then Cambyses II between 530 and 522, and even more, and then Darius is where we'll start our story. And if you notice, Cyrus actually has taken, even just in his first conquering, a lot of these little islands here where the Ionian Greek city-states would be. And this is how the Greeks and the Persians start fighting in the first place, and that is in the Ionian Revolt. So this is kind of zoomed in right here, is where it would be. And basically, this city-state right here, Miletus, and then eventually a ton of these other small city-states that are Greek, decided the Persians stink. They have really high taxes. They have have a governing system which is completely hierarchical with a king at the top, and they didn't like it. They said, let's become what we used to be, which was independent city-states. And so first Miletus was the first one, and they wanted basically as many people as they could that were Greek city-states here to get involved, but they also knew that if they wanted to have any type of success, they were going to need help from the mainland. So they asked, everybody from Greece, help us out, please. And two people decided to do it, and that was two city-states, and that was Eritrea and Athens. Eritrea sent like 5 ships and wasn't really significant, so we won't really care too much about that. But Athens sent 20 ships, and actually were able to help win some battles, and actually go all the way up to Sardis, which is the regional capital of the area, and sacked it. And that was a pretty big deal. That made the Persians pretty mad, understandably. And the Athenians realized that while they were able to sack Sardis, they were probably not going to get much farther than that. So they retreated, they went back home, and hoped that Darius, the king of Persia, wouldn't see that as initiative they had hoped, which Darius did not do. He was very upset to hear about that, and when he came back, he defeated most of the Greek city-states here. And so between about 499, your handout should show this, about 499 to 493, all of the city-states that are in the edge of Asia Minor have been conquered by the Persians again. And Darius did not forget, Darius the king of Persia did not forget that Eritrea and Athens had sent troops to help. And so he decided that he was going to send a small force, not as massive as later armies would be, just to punish basically Athens and Eritrea, which is exactly what he did. And that is what gets us into 490 BC, which is the attack. And Marathon is basically where it happens, which is right around here, right around where Athens is, almost between Athens and Eritrea. And it's about 25,000 soldiers probably of Persians, which is a smaller force of about 10,000 Greeks. This is a smaller battle comparatively to some of the later battles, mostly because the Persians here were only really trying to punish Athens, and so a lot of the rest of Greece didn't even get involved. Athens asked for help from Sparta, and Sparta said, not my problem. So they were stuck in this war by themselves. But against all odds, a particular leader named Miltiades was leading the charge for the Greeks, and he was able to do this kind of encircling maneuver here and defeat the Persians. And it's quite an insane victory. It was probably one of the first times that encirclement tactic kind of happened in military warfare, and it meant that the first invasion kind of Greece was stopped, which was a huge victory. And now, this is also the first time that we'll be introduced to Themistocles. Themistocles was actually at the battle on the Greek side, and he might have even been one of the generals that was commanding with
Miltiades. But what he saw when he saw the Persians retreating was a threat. He saw them as a threat that would probably return, which was something that was not the most popular. Miltiades himself had just won that battle, and when he went back to Athens in 490, he was a hero. He was the man who had defeated the Persians single-handedly almost. And Athens saw him as a hero, and most of Greece saw him as the hero. And so when he didn't see the Persians as a threat in the future, because he thought if they came over again, we could do the same thing that he did the first time. But Themistocles, who had just returned here, saw it as a much bigger threat than anybody else. And he particularly thought that if the Persians decided to attack again, which they probably would, that they were going to need a navy. Because one of the reasons that Darius wasn't as effective is because he did have a navy coming, but it kind of got sunk by a storm, which happens to be a kind of a recurring theme for the Persians. They were not, the storms were not friendly to them. But Themistocles knew that if they wanted to have a chance, if the Persians were to establish a full-scale invasion of of Greece, which would be a lot larger than just trying to punish Athens and Eritrea, they were going to need to have ships, basically. And he took that opportunity to help with that in 483 when the Laon silver mines were discovered. Now, this is what they look kind of like. They basically just found a ton of silver right near Athens, and most Athenians were like, hooray, we got money, we'll put it into, my bank account, your bank account, maybe some infrastructure, maybe the economy, but that's all that they were going to do with it. And Themistocles realized that this was probably their best chance at building a navy that could defeat the Persians if the Persians were to invade. But he also realized that that was not a very popular idea right now. Nobody really wanted to think about the Persians. They thought, we had beat them already, what's the point? And so Themistocles had to kind of change his angle on it. And what he did is, at the time, Greece was actually, Athens was at war with Aegina. As I said, the Greeks are always fighting somebody else. And so Aegina was another Greek island that they were at war with. And so he said, hey, well, we're not worried about the Persians, but Agentia over there, we're at war with them. What if we build a ton of ships so that we could defeat them? And the Greeks said, oh, that's a great idea. So then the Athenians did, and they were able to build about 200 triremes. And so when the Persians did invade about 3 years later, Themistocles, because of his leadership in this way, was set over the navy kind of unofficially, because it was actually set under Eurybates, who was a Spartan, but everybody knew that Eurybates did not know what he was doing because he was a Spartan, and the Spartans didn't really do naval stuff. They were a land army people, and so the Athenians let Eurybates be the naval commander because they wanted to appease the Spartans, but everybody knew that Themistocles was the guy that was really in charge. Now, it was at the same time that Themistocles was rising and becoming incredibly famous that there was a storm brewing in Persia, and that storm is this guy right here under that umbrella there, and his name was Xerxes. So Xerxes was the son of Darius, and imagine if you were born and the first thing you see is a huge palace all around you. There's tons of things praising your dad and the greatness of the Persian Empire, and imagine having an empire that was as large as that and being born into that. And that is somewhat of what Xerxes felt like. Even here you can see he probably didn't have to tie his shoes ever earlier. Even with holding a umbrella, this guy had it all. This guy was probably about as different as you could get from Themistocles, who was born as a regular guy and had to rise up the ranks through Athenian things. One of the things that that we can find about, we don't have a lot of Persian sources, but some of the sources we have about him are just engravings, especially in Persepolis. And he would basically leave this wherever he built things, and he would say stuff like, I am Xerxes, the great king, the king of kings, the king of countries containing many kinds of men, king in the great earth, far and wide, son of King Darius, an Achaemenian, a Persian, son of Persians. So as you can see, this guy was all about the grandeur and all about having a lot of stuff. And that's how he led. While Themistocles was much more sly and more of an Odyssean character, who was much more focused on figuring out which side was going to win and then getting to that side. Xerxes had all the power, and he was born with that way. He was born into it, and therefore it was his way or the highway. So when he kind of gained command, he had an opportunity to attack Greece, or he had an opportunity not to. And he decided that why not, he would invade, and he would invade in the way that a classic Persian style, which was amass the largest military that had been seen in the world, and just throw it right at the Greeks. And that's basically what he did. While Greece made about 200 ships and had a navy that was maybe 300, 350 ships at its height, Persia had almost maybe between 600 and 1,200 ships, and between 120,000 men and 300,000 men, which is an incredible number at the time. And so he decided in 480 BC that he wanted not only to defeat the Greeks completely, but also to defeat the Greeks completely in what they call one military season. So when it comes to military campaigns, when it comes to winter, you only just like sit around and wait for the winter to go away because it's not good times for war. And what Xerxes knew is that if he were to invade, it would be a lot more trouble if he were to stop and have to winter, because Persepolis is very, very far from where Greece is. So having a supply line there would be very difficult. So he wanted to just sweep in there with a massive military, take it over completely, and be back by Christmas. So, here are some of the things that he achieved, or he did to get there. The first thing is, he's in Turkey, which is this thing here, which is kind of cut off. But this is Turkey, this is Greece. So you can just go across, but that means that you might have to fight a sea battle going across here. So instead, he built a giant pontoon bridge right across here. Now, it doesn't look very big, but it is incredibly long. They had about 700 triremes set like in this way across that. He tried to do it the first time, and it got destroyed by a storm. As I said, storms are not their friends. And Xerxes decided, because he needed to punish the water, to give the water there 300 lashes and threw chains into it. So I guess take that, Aegean Sea. Now he also came. He was coming around this way, and he decided, partially because it was helpful and partially because it was cool, to do what's called the Xerxes Canal here, which this is shown from above, or where it would be from above, and this is the isthmus right here. It's called the Athos Isthmus. He basically just cut a canal right across there, and he did it for two reasons. One, because he wanted to actually get ships through it, and two, basically because he wanted to intimidate the Greeks, and that was a huge thing that Xerxes and Persians in general loved to do, was to make really grand structures, really grand achievements, just to scare and to impress their enemies into being fearful. Because one of the things that he was able to do is, because of some of these feats of abilities, he was able to get a lot of Greek city-states to join him in this invasion, because they thought, if Persia's going to take over, I might as well be on their side of it when it all happens, than be on the other side and then have my city destroyed. So places like Macedonia around here, a lot of Ionian city-states that actually agreed with and joined Xerxes. One particular leader who is being put in later is called Artemisia, who was the queen or the tyrant of Halicarnassus, and she was pretty important because she was a woman and she was a Greek as well. But the fact that she was a woman made a lot of Greeks pretty mad, actually. And while Xerxes was fine with it, Athens itself put a large bounty on her head because they thought, it's embarrassing that a woman is even fighting against us, and so we need to catch her. But anyway, he comes around here, he builds his pontoon bridge, he builds his canal, and ends up right around here is where they first are engaged with the allied forces, which would be Leonidas would be leading a lot of the soldiers here on the land for the Greeks, and then right here is where Themistocles would be with the leader. And so the first battle we have to kind of talk about is Thermopylae and Ardesilum. If you know any Greek battles, Thermopylae is one of the big ones because of the famous last stand of Leonidas and his men. And it happens around here, and then we zoom in even closer to here. But we're going to focus more on the other battle, which was the Battle of Artemisium, which was basically right here. And that was because they needed to defend. If the navy were to come through here and attack from the other side, then Thermopylae would have been even more of a Persian victory. And so Themistocles was able to mostly have a stalemate, but it was only more of a victory for the Greeks at Artemisium because another storm came through and destroyed about 200 Persian ships. So once again, the storm is like the biggest enemy of the Persian ships. But what they realized though was that they needed even the Persians wanted open sea for a battle like this because Xerxes knew he could just overpower them with numbers. So and Themistocles knew that, so he never wanted to engage them in the open sea. He always wanted to be in straits like this, where it would be basically a one-on-one situation where if you have fewer ships, you could possibly defeat him. But even this strait here, which was pretty small, was still not small enough for a huge victory for the Greeks. But because of this defeat, Thermopylae fell because of Greek betrayal, and it fell. It meant that basically the Persians were able to march right through all the way to Athens actually, and they were able to sack Athens, which was Themistocles' hometown, destroyed. And so at this point, a lot of the Greeks are thinking, well, this stuff's cooked. Let's just defend right here. And so this place right here at Corinth, it's called the Isthmus of Corinth. It's a tiny little spot. If we just sit there, we can sit tight and we'll be fine. But Themistocles knew if they sit tight there, first off, they still might lose. And second off, they're probably never getting back to Athens. And that's his hometown, and he wants it back. So he decided to stop at a place that would be too small to see. So we're going to go to the next slide. So this is what the Greek map looks like this. Looks like that, which is very small. And then this is Salamis. And then zoom in even closer is where the actual battle of Salamis happens. And so the Greeks end up here. And most of the Greeks want to retreat. They think this is not the place to fight, we need to defend the isthmus. And Themistocles realizes this. So the first thing he does is he makes sure that there's no way that they can leave. And so he actually sends a letter to Xerxes and says, hey, if you block us off here, we can't escape. Which is exactly what Xerxes decided to do. Which shows once again how sly and how like Odysseus almost Themistocles is. Some would say that was a very stupid move because if it didn't work out, it would make him look incredibly dumb. But he knew that if it worked out, this might be the only chance that they could defeat the Persians at sea. And so what he realized is, if he could get the Persians in here somehow, into the Salamis Channel, which is very, very small, as you can see, it's zoomed in like 3 times, they might have a chance to win. But there was no way, unless the Persians did it themselves, that they could get them in here. And so he decided, the Persians are assuming that they're going to win soon, right? Because a lot of the Athenians and a lot of the Greeks in general are really afraid. So he says, what if I send a letter over there and say, hey, we're going to retreat and try to get through here. If you come and attack us, you could probably defeat us. So he sends a spy that does that as well. And Xerxes at this point is thinking, they're falling apart here, let's take this place over. But he still has a choice whether or not to actually engage. And most of his generals are saying, yes, we should do it. And the only voice, somewhat of reason, is Artemisia actually, who thinks this is not the smart idea. Because basically, if we wait this out, we can surround them, or they'll have to move into more open areas of water, and that is where we actually have the advantage. There's no reason to push it, even if we could have a victory now, because there's no reason. They already have the advantage. But Xerxes, as he does, decides that he will instead engage right away and pushes himself right into this spot, and that is, instead of seeing retreating soldiers, or retreating ships, he gets attacked from all sides. Athenians, Corinthians, Spartans, Argentines, all across this are completely destroying their ships. Xerxes himself actually wanted to watch the battle because in the last battle, the Battle of Artemisium, he thought that they were probably being not good soldiers, and so this time he set up a little spot to watch, and he was not happy with what he saw. About 300 ships of the Persians, which was probably about half their fleet, was destroyed, but only 40 of the Greek ships were destroyed, and they were set to be pushed out. And so Xerxes, once again, had a choice, a third choice, whether he should continue or not, especially with his navy. And the thing was, his navy was now about the same size. His navy was a little bit smaller than the Greeks. So he still did have a chance, but Artemisia, who had been smarter in the last engagement, had told him it's probably better to retreat now because the chances of us winning so that on their side of it, especially when they've been winning most of these battles, winning this particular battle very well, would not be smart. And so he finally does take that advice, and he retreats, leaving Mygdonis there. And Themistocles, as he always does, was wanting to take advantage of anything he could, and so he wanted to actually attack the Persians as they retreated, especially he wanted to go to the Hellespont, where the little crossing was, and destroy those ships that on the bridge. But then he realized that none of the rest of the Athenians and the rest of the Greeks were on board with that, so instead he said, oh, actually, I'll send a letter to Xerxes to say, I'm letting you go, just in case if he ever had trouble with the Greeks, that he could actually be in the good graces of the Persians, which is interesting to think about right after he defeated them, trying to get somewhat in the good graces. Now, in the aftermath, we're going to talk about Greece itself, and we're going to talk about Themistocles himself. The Greeks did very well after this. The Delian League was set up partially because of the navy that had now been created, which was an economic and political kind of league that was led by Athens, and it did very well. This is a period called the Greek kind of golden age, which was a time of like political, philosophical, economic growth, and it did incredibly well. Sparta is this other country that they did pretty well, but now we'll have to talk a little bit about Themistocles. And Themistocles, while he was a very famous person among the people of Athens, he was not famous at all among the elites, who thought he was selfish, which to some degree he was, and that he was always trying to just get his way or do what's best for him, not for the actual city. And so he was actually ousted by Athens, and then because most of the rest of the Greek world was led by Sparta, and Sparta didn't like him because he was Athenian, he ended up living most of his life, at the end of his life, right around here, in what is now Persia, under Persian rule, basically, which is quite the reversal of where he started, mostly because of his own slyness kind of caught up with him, and he was never able to kind of settle down in one spot. For Persia, Xerxes retreated, and he made basically his main goal to build up Persepolis, which is the capital of Persia, and he lived and governed for another 20-some years, and Persia remained as the main power in the world for another 150 years before Alexander the Great, of course, defeated him. But in the end, it seems as though the leader who learned more from the Battle of Salamis was actually Xerxes himself, who learned how to govern and defend his own lands much better than Themistocles, who continued his conniving ways and to his own peril. So just to kind of wrap up with some significance, I think it's important just to recognize that Persia, while it did stay strong, it didn't get even larger, which it possibly could have. And I think what's really important about the battle is just the Athenian and the Greek flourishing that occurred because of it. We don't know what would have happened if the Persians had won at that battle or any battle after that, but we do know that because of the battle, Greece was able to build this economy and build this small league because of that, which led to people like Plato, Aristotle, all those other people that became really important in philosophy, political thought, even art and drama. If you think of someone like Aeschylus or other playwrights, Greek playwrights, became very famous, and you can't imagine that that would have been the case, or the same way at least, if the Persians had had more victories. And finally, Greece has not just flourished even past when it was defeated by Alexander the Great. That influence has kind of spread all over the world in modern day. Alexander the Great in particular spread a lot of their culture and their thought and even their language. The Romans adopted it, and even in the Renaissance, as you see pictured here, they take a lot of ideas from the ancient Greeks that you can see. And I think the other thing I want to talk about is significant as a Christian historian, or just as a Christian in general. And I think what I really enjoyed about doing this research is seeing God's plan in it. And I have this picture here mostly just because pretty often when it comes to history, it's hard to know exactly what God's doing or try to assume what God's doing. But I think that in this particular battle, you can see kind of these empires here and how God uses those empires. Medo-Persia is the empire that we dealt with mostly in this talk, but also At the time that Medo-Persia was invading, they were actually with or allied with the Macedonians, which is very odd because Macedonia, after the war, after the Persians were defeated, became its own thing, and eventually would be people that became the Greek Empire. And so it's interesting to see how the different empires rise and fall in God's plan. And I think that this is just a snapshot, a tiny little snapshot of how God works in His world. And I think the other thing that I've learned just a lot from this project is just about human nature, but particularly about Themistocles and Xerxes. I think it's easy to look back in history and see these old people that seem as if they're not even real, almost mythological, or in such a different world from us that they're not even human almost. And reading and researching a ton about Themistocles and about Xerxes and about these Greek leaders shows that cultures are different, certainly. And certainly a long time ago, things were very different. But we're all still humans. And you can see things like attributes of Xerxes and attributes of Themistocles today. Do you know any political leaders that are gung-ho and always forcing their way and won't listen to their advisors at all in the world today? I think they would probably think of some. Can you think of anybody in governments or things today that will always be switching sides and switching ideas, whichever makes them the most famous or powerful? Certainly you can see that as well. And I think that doing history shows us all of the bad things about humanity, about the sin of humanity, but also shows the image of God, even in pagans like Xerxes and Themistocles. And while they made a lot of mistakes and they were sinful people, I think what's interesting is to see even the skills that they portrayed in their leadership. So I want to finish my talk with a quote by Augustine, talking about the city of man and about the city of God. And he says, "For those pagan heroes, there was not to be divine grace of everlasting life. On the other hand, if God did not grant them at least the temporal glory of a splendid empire, there would have been no reward for their praiseworthy efforts and the virtues by which they strive to attain that glory." I think that sums up a lot of what I see when I read things about Themistocles and about Xerxes. They were given their reward by giving the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and to some degree Themistocles was given his reward by having to be sent to the Persian Empire himself, because he was too selfish in some ways to be part of Athens. But I want to finish off with talking about the city of God. The reward of the saint is altogether different. That city is eternal. And there is no one born because no one dies. There reigns that true and perfect happiness, that which is not the goddess, but a gift of God. Thank you so much.
Questions or comments or thoughts? I'll take this one.
Right now,
What's your process for, I know some of the primary sources from this time period are not always accurate. What was your process for trying to figure out, just to what extent things are organization of people versus this is what actually happened?
that's a really good question, and so very hard to answer. I think oh shoot.
Here's the mic. Okay, that's a really good question. It's really tough because especially a lot of stories are just told by one person, and a lot of what you actually read is stories. So you'll get Herodotus will tell a story or give quotes of Themistocles, and it's there's no way those are the actual words of Themistocles. So a lot of it's trying to build up what we think the character of the person was, and certain things are easier to kind of verify. Things like the canal that they built, they actually have found archaeological things at that, and a lot of battles as well. They're able to find archaeological pieces of that. So a lot of the battles you can have guesses of where they were, what he's talking about when things are happening. But a lot of the personality, I guess, is you kind of build that out of multiple different stories that are saying things, and you just say, yeah, you have, it's kind of guesswork, I guess. I don't know how to say it better than that. Some things are pretty outrageous. There's one description of the Persians attacking Delphi, which is like a prophetic place, and like a Delphi prophet comes out and like rains thunder down them, and so I was like, that's probably not what actually happened. But other ones are a lot more difficult to figure out is that real or is that just somebody did a story at some point and Herodotus heard it or Plutarch heard it or somebody wrote it down. Yeah.
I actually kind of had a similar question because of the disparity of sources. We have so much more for the Greeks than we do for the Persians, and a lot of what we're relying on from the Persian side of things, what you talked about, like the legends and things like that. How do you kind of approach that in your own scholarship? Like just reading the Greek sources and trying to put that into perspective as you're trying to tell us.
That was probably the hardest part, honestly, is you have a ton of Greeks writing about this from their perspective, and whatever Persian sources, if there were any that were written, they probably were like, the only stuff that we have left is basically inscriptions, and most of the inscriptions are not talking about wars and stuff. And you can imagine that that probably wasn't what they were thinking about writing down. Is, oh yeah, I got defeated this one time. So a lot of it is looking at like archaeological evidence, and also just they're taking a lot of what the Greeks say with a grain of salt, I think, because the Greeks will talk in ways that sound authoritative that sometimes just don't actually make any sense. So I think it's very hard to actually like characterize well what exactly they were thinking. Even like the stuff with Artemisia or with Xerxes himself, like those are probably some Persian probably told Herodotus about it, but they're still going to have an angle of Greek kind of influence on it. So it's a lot of kind of doing your best with what you have and trying to be very critical of the Greek sources and not taking it for granted. Yeah.
So I enjoyed your delivery, and as you may remember from certain other courses, there are modes of implotment that historians use as they tell tales about the past, and your comic delivery made me wonder how that came about. Is that something that is this a kind of common way in which this story is told between these two figures, or is this something that you sort of intuited and fashioned according to your own, in a little more of a self-conscious way, according to your own worldview or something?
I think most of the way I'm doing it is just do it in an interesting way. I think I don't know. It looks very different what I'm like the essay I wrote and the presentation I gave, mostly because I assume that most people here would not have the same not necessarily be as interested as I am in this subject. So a lot of it probably is just in the effort of making it interesting to people that might not know much about it or not care if I didn't try to make it fun, I guess, to make it funny.
So do you see the story as comically shaped historically?
I think it is I think it's just very interesting. Yeah, I do think it is somewhat funny. I think the number of storms that happen is somewhat comic, particularly for Xerxes. But I also think that the ways that the way that it works out, the way how like themistocles starts as like a Greek and has to basically trick his way through through most of what he's doing that ends up in Persia, I think is quite comic. And the fact that Xerxes doing the lashes, who knows if that's realistic, but I think that's funny. So I think that there is some comedy to it, I guess. And I think just the differences of the Greek and the Persians, I think is the fact that they clash in that way, it makes for some interesting and funny moments, I think, in history.
I don't know if there's a book that's come out, I think in the last year, and it's it's called The Wolf Girl, the Greeks and the Gods. It's like a children's book story about these Persian wars. So it looks like you maybe haven't heard of it, so now you need to put it on your Christmas list. I think it's a book that you would really love, because the author, I think, like you, just finds this time of history fascinating, and he wrote this book. It's not like a children's book, like 50 pages, it's like 200 pages or something. But it's told from the perspective of Gorgo, Leonidas' wife, the queen of Sparta. So it follows her from her childhood and up through these wars. And it's a really fun, interesting retelling. But part of it is that the author chose to keep the elements of mythology in the story. And so then, like, when he throws the chains and things into the water, Poseidon is rightly enraged. And that accounts for the ongoing problems that he has.
Oh, the storms. Oh, there you go.
Maybe
That's what it was.
His anger at Poseidon. That was just a book that I wanted to recommend to you. It's another, I felt like a like-minded person with you who really loved this part of history, and then did a really interesting retelling that's sort of for, I don't know, like the 6th, 7th, 8th grade person. So you might enjoy reading that for fun.
Thank you. I'll put it on the Christmas list.
Alright, Daniel. What would be your advice for a reader to guard against the harmful pitfalls of mysticism?
That's a good question. It was interesting kind of come up with kind of like what I wanted to say about it, because the famous quote of like, if you don't like read history, you'll be doomed to repeat it. Doesn't really work in this case unless you're have a large scale invasion of another country with thousands of soldiers. So I think a lot of it just has to do with listening to people around you, and one of the reasons that I think the weaknesses of Themistocles are somewhat the strengths of Xerxes in certain ways, where Themistocles is very able to kind of work in a system by being on whichever side kind of wins out, which is his strength, but it's also his weakness in that he doesn't really have one side of his own. So I think the danger of that is being a little too selfish and always trying to do what just is best for you rather than what's better for the system. And I think Xerxes' problem is just he's in a system where he's asking for his advisors to help him, but he also kind of has his own agenda, and if you don't agree with that, he's going to be pretty overrated to you. So put yourself in situations where people can give you advice that you'll actually take, I think is big for both of them. I think both of them are not, I don't think Themistocles or Xerxes were very humble about taking advice well. Because both of them thought that most of the time their advice was important and they weren't. Themistocles sometimes was and sometimes he wasn't. And Xerxes certainly was not. So.
Anyone else? Do you have a question?
Oh, you do?
Was he involved in how much in the formation of the
That's a good question. Honestly, after the Battle of Salamis, I kind of stopped paying as much attention on him. He probably has some, I imagine he helps to some degree, but he also gets kind of kicked to the curb pretty fast. The Battle of Salamis itself, without that, I don't see it really showing up the way it did. So he definitely, his influence even after Salamis definitely contributed to the creation of the UN League, especially since they were kind of, their navy was a big part of why that was able to be created and sustained. Was a lot of economic kind of trade, and that needed a navy to keep that kind of where it was.